History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived. But, if approached with courage, need not be lived again. Hi again, and welcome to this history, the channel that brings us all a bit closer to the history that's all around us, and along the way try and make it a bit fun and a bit engaging. But anyway, that quote that I opened with, I hope you liked it, first of all. It's actually from a poem called On the Pulse of Morning by a woman called Dr. Maya Angelou. Remarkable woman, she really was, and she read that poem actually at the president's inauguration, President Clinton, in 1993. She was the first African American and the first woman to read poetry at a president's inauguration. Like I say, a truly remarkable woman, creative, intelligent, brilliant, beautiful soul. Fortunately, she died, I think, in 2014, I think it was. I think she was 86 when she died. But she was a writer, a poet, social activist, and like I say, just truly brilliant. Dr. Maya Angelou, I'll put her name up here in the corner somewhere. Go and check her out, check out her stuff. It really is worth the time. And those words, I think, are food for thought at the moment, at least. Anyway, onwards we must travel, right? And I think we've got another fact-filled week of history for us. If you saw the episode last week, you know the drill. If not, essentially what we do is go through the calendar week, take a historical fact that occurred on each day and break it up into little bite-sized chunks, something to talk about, right? If nothing else. Last thing I'll say before we get going, please, if you haven't done so already, please subscribe, it helps me out. And if you subscribe, I can let you know about other stuff that's coming to the channel. Like the videos, comments on the videos, share the love amongst your friends, families, loved ones, all of that stuff. But no time to waste, I think. Let's go, let's get to it. So today, the 15th of June, marks the 805th anniversary of the signing of the Magna Carta. Yes, on this day, June 15th, 1215, King John puts pen to paper and signs the Magna Carta. But King John was essentially forced into signing the Magna Carta by his barons, by his nobles. And basically the Magna Carta, or the Great Charter as it was known, essentially operated as a peace treaty between King John and his people. Why did John need a peace treaty with his own people? Good question. Now essentially John's reign was one big failure, right? He lost the Duchy of Normandy in France. He taxed his nobility and his barons really heavily to pay for his foreign misadventures, I think is the best way of putting it. He argued with Pope Innocent III. He sold church buildings to build up the royal coffers, again to pay for his foreign misadventures. Being basically a bit fed up with the situation, the barons rose up against John. Essentially made him an offer that he couldn't refuse. So being outmatched, outgunned, outthought, John, it was his only way, signing Magna Carta was his only way of avoiding open rebellion. So on June 15th, 1215, John met with his barons, a place called Runnymede on the Thames, and signed what was known as the Article of the Barons, which after a few amendments was later issued as the Magna Carta. Now it's worth knowing that it was one big failure anyway. Civil War did break out, which led to further amendments, further reissues by later monarchs. I think, well, story for another time, I think best. Maybe I'll do a History Now episode on the subject of the Magna Carta and we can look at it in a bit more depth. Now, June 16th, 1963, I've got to say, I like this one, I really do like this one. June 16th, 1963, a woman called Valentina Tereshkova becomes the first woman in space. An absolutely brilliant achievement from a brilliant woman. Now Valentina, she was born into a peasant family in Russia. I think by 18 she was working in a textiles factory. Really interestingly, by 22 she was actually a very accomplished parachutist. at a local aviation club, right? And this caught the eye of Soviet authorities, who wanted to send a woman into space as another victory, another way to beat the US, another victory in the space race. She was selected to join the Vostok space program and was aboard Vostok 6 when it launched on this date, June the 16th, 1963. I think the craft itself actually was automated, I think, if I remember rightly. The craft was automated. She never actually piloted it. She did a few orbits and such. And then when she came back into the atmosphere, I think her parachute skills really came in quite handy. She was ejected from the capsule at 20,000 feet and safely made her way to Earth. Now, interestingly, her 48 orbits of Earth took 71 hours, I think it was, 71 hours, and at that time, she had spent more time in space than all of the other American astronauts put together. So Yuri Gagarin, that's 2-0, America, 2-0. Now, in last week's episode, we spoke about how on June 14th, the Nazis invaded Paris. Well, just 3 days later, on this day, June the 17th, 1940, the Marshal Henri Pétain announces the intention to surrender against the Nazis. Now, Pétain was a hero, right? A military hero from World War I, and he was actually made vice premier just a month earlier, in May 1940, to actually boost morale, because the French were suffering so much heavily against the Nazi invasion. Well, whatever morale there was quickly dissipated after the announcement to surrender. Pétain actually signed the armistice with the Nazis on June the 25th. Pétain essentially collaborated with the Nazis. He set up office as chief of state in the little town called Vichy in unoccupied France. This is what we call the Vichy government. But like I say, collaborated with the Nazis. This collaboration just led to French people suffering in both occupied and unoccupied France. Just a couple of years later, Pétain was reduced essentially just to a figurehead. There's a man called Pierre Laval. He had won the favour, won the trust of Adolf Hitler. And essentially, well, Laval was a true fascist, a true Nazi sympathiser, earmarked as the person to essentially run France for the Nazis. I guess the best way of thinking about Pierre Laval was the French equivalent of Max Mosley. Ultimately, though, both Pétain and Laval met their fate after the Allies' invasion of Normandy. Both Laval and Pétain ran for Nazi cover, basically, Nazi protection. However, they were captured. They were both tried for high treason and both sentenced to death. However, interestingly, the French Premier Charles de Gaulle actually commuted Pétain's sentence to life imprisonment, saved his life, essentially. And he didn't die, I don't think, until 1951. You know, I was going to talk about Napoleon being defeated at Waterloo, because that happened on this day, 18th of June, 1815, but I've changed my mind. We're not going to talk about that. I don't want to hear about it, right? Because I think it's much more apt to say that almost 20 years to the day since the first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova, the first American woman, made the same journey on this day in 1983. Now, after considering female astronauts in the late 50s and the early 60s, it actually wasn't until the late 70s that NASA finally saw sense. So after answering an advert in a newspaper, I think it was, for a young savvy tech scientist, a woman called Sally Ride was selected from 3,000 applicants to be one of 6 women to join NASA. Amazing woman. Bachelor of Science in Physics, Bachelor of Arts in English, right? A Master's and a Doctorate in Physics. I mean, she almost became a professional tennis player. I mean, talk about having talent, right? She was like one of those kids at school that was just great at everything, right? Which totally wasn't me. I was crap at everything. Anyway, she worked as a communicator on various NASA missions in the early 80s before actually finally being selected to be part of the crew for the Space Shuttle Challenger. So she spent the 6 days in space on Challenger, conducting various missions such as satellite repairs, actually conducting lots of experiments as well. I think one of the experiments was understanding the effects on the socialization of ants at zero gravity. Ants in space, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, that's like a 1950s sci-fi horror movie, isn't it? Ants in space. Love that. I mean, nobody ever mentions the ants, do they? Nobody ever mentions the ants. Why don't we mention the ants? So on this day, the 18th of June, 1983, Sally Ride becomes the first American woman in space. And a small colony of ants become probably the first ants in space. Now it's on this day, the 19th of June, 1865, that the abolition of slavery was announced in the state of Texas, a date that is known as Juneteenth. So this day is essentially the end of slavery in America, although, having said this, Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was actually issued 2 years earlier in 1863 on New Year's Day, I think it was, I'm sure, the 1st of January 1863. However, it's 2 years later until Texas, the state of Texas, finally announces the end of slavery. Now, Texas were the last state still trading in slaves. Essentially, a lack of Union troops made the Emancipation Proclamation order difficult to enforce. However, there is some debate amongst historians, really. Some believe that it took so long because of difficulties or problems in communication mechanisms, poor communication essentially. Or other historians believe that no slave owners from the rebel state of Texas actually purposely withheld that information. I'll let you decide what you think it is. Essentially though, Major General Gordon Granger, strong name that, announced General Order Number 3, which in a nutshell, all slaves were now free men and had equal rights. Now, despite being, despite the recommendation, if you like, being advised to stay where you worked, but now work for fair pay, 250,000 people left the state of Texas. Former slaves, free men, free women now, left the state of Texas, moved to different states in search of lost loved ones and lost family. Now, Juneteenth is celebrated as an Independence Day for African Americans. In 47 different states, it is a state holiday. There are 50 states in America, if you didn't know. 47, it's a state holiday. It's not a national holiday. That has never actually been passed through Congress. Sort it out, America. You know, last week I made a joke about chatting someone up with the pickup line, hey, did you know that on this day the German cabinet resigned over the deadlock of the Treaty of Versailles? Well, on this day, June the 20th, it's actually true. So basically, there's a big conference going on at Versailles it's essentially the terms that will end the First World War. The Allied forces meeting together. Germany, the German ministers were invited to attend but not allowed to take part. Now the Germans, for their part, they had faith in what they'd heard from President Wilson, which was peace without victory. However, when they received the treaty, it wasn't quite what they were expecting, right? So there was a 13% loss in territory, a 10% loss in population. They have to disband their military. And on top of all this, reparation payments to the Allied forces for the cost of the war. So this puts the whole German cabinet in deadlock, right? They've received the treaty. Some ministers want to accept it, get on with rebuilding the country, get on with commerce, manufacturing, that sort of stuff. Other ministers are like, no way, totally not having it. This sucks. I think it's the foreign minister who's actually quoted as saying something along the lines of, you know, you don't need this big fat volume with all these words. You can just give us a sentence saying Germany seeks to exist. So chaos, right? Deadlock. The whole cabinet resigned in mass protest, leaving the President, Friedrich Ebert, presiding over an empty cabinet. Now, remarkably, he cobbles together a cabinet in a very short space of time, and it wasn't until June the 23rd, which was the deadline day, that they signed what was then to be called the Treaty of Versailles. About 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I think it was, really on the wire. Interestingly, June the 23rd, it was signed, which is exactly 5 years to the day since the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife were murdered in Sarajevo, which essentially kicked off the war in the first place. Finishing off our week in history, 21st of June 1675, and Christopher Wren lays the first stone of the rebuilding of St Paul's Cathedral in London. Christopher Wren is, he's another one of these characters, these people from history, who are just incredibly talented, an absolute bona fide genius. Even as a boy, he distinguished himself in every single discipline that he put his hand to: scientific discovery, engineering, architecture, all of it. And then it was after the Great Fire of London, King Charles II gave Christopher Wren the commission to rebuild all of the city's great churches. So Wren got to work designing St Paul's Cathedral. However, his first few designs actually got rejected by the clergy, essentially. His first design got rejected, I think, for being too Greek. His next design, I think, got rejected for being too modern. Essentially, the clergy wanted a church, a traditional-looking church. So Wren gave in, and he designed exactly what they wanted, a traditional-looking church. So after designing what they wanted, Wren got to work. He started to build. However, King Charles actually signed a warrant for Wren to be able to make ornamental changes along the way as he's building it, as long as these changes weren't fundamental. But what Wren changed was absolutely fundamental. He lost the spire that was in the design. He massively increased the size of the dome. He raised the height of the aisle walls. What we see today is miles away from the design that Wren made. Now, the whole building work was done behind scaffolding, done behind cover, essentially. Now, by the time the clergy realised what it actually looked like, they were outraged, right? But it was too late. Building was well underway. Now, Christopher Wren is actually laid to rest in St Paul's Cathedral. That's where his tomb is. And on his tomb, there's a plaque with the words in Latin inscribed on it: "Reader, if you seek his memorial, look around you." I mean, how cool is that? I absolutely love it. Fantastic stuff. And there we have it. Done. Episode 2. Done. Out the way. How was it for you, my darling? I enjoyed it immensely, actually. Brilliant. Loved it. Anyway, no, thanks for coming along. I have so much fun making these. I hope you enjoy watching them. I really do. If you do subscribe, please do subscribe. Share the video. Write some comments in. Talk to me. Let conversation makes the world go round. Talk to me. Tell me how your day is, right? Or tell me something interesting. Tell me an interesting fact. Tell me a fact about history. Maybe you know something that happened next week in history. Tell me about it, and I'll may even include it. Let's do something like that, right? Or even tell me what your favourite flavour of pot noodle is. Tell me something. Talk to me, guys. I want to hear from you guys. I really do. But again, I really do enjoy making these. I hope you enjoy watching them. And we'll be back next week for another This Week in History. Cheers, guys. Much love.